Hey guys, this is Shane, Echo Soundworks here. In this video, I'm going to show you a bunch of techniques, tips, and tricks that you can use to create a future bounce drop. All right, so this video is in support of our newest sound set and sample pack, Sphere. Sphere is a collection of world sounds for Serum, kind of re-envisioned, reimagined for the modern producer. So you can use these sounds in pretty much any genre. Now, I created a future bounce demo for the main Sphere demo, and that's what we're gonna be looking at in this video. So we're gonna look at how you can create your bass line, how you can create your lead, how that all fits together. And then we're also gonna look at how of course, you can take sounds from Sphere and layer those in with more common, kind of typical sounds for future bounce to get a sound really unique and really original to you. So let's dive into Logic and get started. All right, so that is the track and that's the drop section. So first thing we're gonna look at is just the general ingredients to creating a future bounce drop, right? You're gonna have your drum track, you're gonna have a bass line, multiple bass tracks making up that bass line, typically your leads and your chords. So we're gonna start by investigating the drop bass section here. We're not gonna spend a lot of time or really any time talking about the drums because they're pretty straightforward. All right, so the bass line, it's actually 4 tracks gelled into one cohesive track. It helps to have your sub bass on your own, on its own dedicated track. And then you're gonna have a top bass, maybe a mid bass, and you can have like 3 or 4 top basses, mid basses layered together to create a really unique sound. So I wanted to spend more time talking about the theory of the bass line as opposed to the layering. So the theory behind a future bounce, future house bass line might confuse some people because there's a couple of things going on that's not typical for other genres of house music. It's not as straightforward. So what I would suggest doing when you're trying to write a future bounce, future house bass line is to find a bass that you like. Maybe it's a top bass, maybe like work with the sub, right? And then just try to lay down some type of bass line and then go into your MIDI and you can start tweaking. So if you're really good at keys, you can probably play your bass line. But if you're not, you can do something like this. Right? If you're better at keys, you can play different things, but you can just lay something down like something real simple. It doesn't have to be crazy. Now, once you get that in, there's a couple things you can do to make it have that future bounce vibe and have that really nice polished bass line. So I don't consider this a bass line. It's so simple that I wouldn't call it, I mean, a bassist would be like, oh, that's not a bass line. It is, it's something, but I wouldn't actually call it like a proper bass line. Future bounce and future house, they use a lot of times like a proper bass line. You're gonna have elements like walking, kind of like pickup notes, things like that. So that's what we have with this track. So let's unmute and let's listen. Right, it's got that future bounce vibe, and it is in huge part because of these notes up in the higher octave. So the first note's D, second note E, third note F sharp, right? You'll notice that the second hit of our progression is actually a D2, and we're starting on D1, so we're going, right? We're bouncing up and back and forth between the octave range. Now that gives it that future bounce vibe. If I mute these, a little bit of that vibe, but not a lot. So those really make a huge difference. Now all I'm doing is simply taking, okay, I wanted this note right here, right? I wanted this. I'm just, okay, that second note, let's have it jump an octave. So these other notes happening in the higher octave range, they're kind of like walking the bass up, right? So our second note of the actual bass line is an E, right? An E1. You see that before that E1 hits, which is right here, we have a pickup note on E2 that's actually off grid. More on that in a second. And so it's kind of this little walking, very simple bass walk idea. Right, so that's how you can start to get that future bounce vibe. Now, speaking of things off grid, mess around with swing when you're creating your future bounce bass line. This has a lot of notes that this bass line has many notes that aren't right on grid. This one isn't, this one isn't, this one is not, these two are not. I could keep going, right? If I put these on grid, I'll highlight them and quantize. It's gonna sound a lot different. Right? It's a huge difference to get things off of grid and have certain notes kind of jump out. What it will do is it will actually, a lot of times by nudging things off of the grid or by nudging your bass line off the grid or applying swing, it will help certain notes stick out through your sidechain compression, really, if you think about it. So, for instance, a kick is hitting here, a kick is hitting here, right? And a kick is hitting here. Well, this note right here, nothing's really happening in that section, right? It's going to kind of leap out at the listener because it's off of grid and it's not on, you probably don't have a hi-hat right here either. You don't have some other element in the mix, that bass line, it kind of bounces out. That's like how I like to think of it to the listener, and it's pretty prominent, right? And it gives it that bouncy vibe, which is really cool. So that's kind of the theory behind the top bass line. Now I layered that with what I like to think of as a mid bass. It's a square tone. Right, so I just carved out a lot of the frequencies, the low and high frequencies, left mainly the mid frequencies, and you put these two together, you get this. Now in terms of mixing, a little bit of LFO tool, right, for sidechain compression. You can also sidechain compress to your kick, however you like to set that up. Now, the sub bass, let's take a second to talk about that. The sub bass MIDI, you can see, is actually different MIDI from our top bass and our mid bass. I thought it had more driving power to do this, but just bear with me here for a second. If you guys copied and pasted your bass line with the octaves and the jumps and things off of grid, a lot of times what's going to happen is you're going to have notes outside of the sub range, right? Like this note right here isn't a sub note. So what I thought was, okay, well, let's just mute it. But then you're going to have holes in your bass line, in your sub bass, right? You're going to have your sub bass hits at different points from your actual main bass line. So some notes of your bass line are going to lack power. So what I ended up doing was every time one of these octave notes or these bass line notes that were walking hit, I put a sub bass there. And then I ended up kind of extending the notes because it is sidechain compressed, or it's LFO tooled quite hard to where it's not going to be conflicting with the kick. I thought I added more power to the overall bass line. The last thing we're going to talk about in the bass line is kind of like a bonus idea. It actually comes from Brooks. Can't take any credit for this. This is something he does. I was watching one of his masterclass tutorials, and he does this cool thing where it's very complextro of him, like 2014, 2015 actually, where he takes like a one-shot sample or many one-shot samples, like growl basses, just nasty dubstep basses, rhythm basses, whatever, and then pitches up samples to match, the actual bass line. So every time a note hits in his bass line, he's basically having like a new sample trigger, right? So listen. So I ended up tucking that into the mix quite low, but it still sounded cool. All right, so that's how you can create your future bounce bass lines. Let's move on to the leads now. And looking at the leads, this is where we start to check out some of the benefits of using Sphere. So this first track, it's 4 tracks, kind of like our bass line, right? We have multiple layers. This first track is coming from Sylenth. And it's just a pretty cookie cutter sound. It sounds good, but it's not something that you never heard before. Right? So what I ended up doing was I ended up layering that with a couple patches from Sphere. This is a wind instrument. It's a Bonsuri lead. Right? That's like a lead. Dudux is like a kind of resynthesized reed instrument. And you put that all together and you get a much more unique sound. Right? So that's how Sphere can benefit, is you can add these different textures, these different colors to your tracks quite easily. So let's look at the theory behind what makes this work, just like we did with the bass line. So what we're going to do is let's mute some of these, and we're just going to be focusing on the Sylenth one. All right, so the melody's quite open, right? It's not going to you don't want to overpower your bass line. You spend all this time making a cool, groovy bass line. You don't want your melody to do something like this. I'll mute it, and I'll play a new melody, and you don't want your melody to go. Right? You don't want something that busy. It just doesn't make sense. So you want to leave some gaps in your melody to kind of fill in where your bass line's jumping out, or where you have like, okay, I want my bass line to be more impactful to the listener at this point in time. So you can see that these first two notes, right, there's some gaps going on. So this section right here, we're we're going to have a bass note most likely kind of jumping out, right? So right here, we have a bass note happening and we have nothing happening in the lead. So it's this call and response, right? It's a big part of Future Bounce. Now Brooks, this is more of a Mesto track, which I've mentioned a few times. Brooks does this exceedingly well where he'll have like a chord hit for like 2 hits, and then that chord drops out, lead, chord, lead, all while his bass line's doing what we've already looked at, right? So it has this really cool vibe. So let's talk about another little tip and trick that you can follow with your melodies, and that is the use of glide. So you can use kind of these like ghost glide notes. Now a lot of you might think of a glide as like, oh, if I play 2 notes at once and a synth that glides up to it, right? Like this. Well, you can get more creative with your glide, your portamento, depending on how you've set up your synth. So when you're layering synths and layering glide times like this, it's very important to go into the actual synth and make sure your portamento time is similar for all the synths. So we can see here in Sylenth that my portamento is set to 25.3 milliseconds. And if we go to the Bonsuri lead from Sphere, we're going to have a similar, I'm going to have a similar portamento, 26 milliseconds, right? So it's very important to have that similar portamento, similar attack time and release time as well. Otherwise, when you start to layer, you're not just dealing with frequencies and dealing with getting the frequencies to kind of match and not overpower each other. You're also going to be like, well, why isn't this fitting together? Check that if you're running into issues. But the glides, check this out. This note right here is a great example. This, because it's a monophonic patch, can't play more than one note at a time. This right here is just, this note's going to glide down to this and back up to that. Right? And I can change this by changing not only the duration of this kind of ghost glide note, but also its pitch. Right? If I pitch this down, right, it's a whole different sound. So you can really play around with your glides and what's happening. And another great example of that is over a little bit further in the melody. This one is a great one. So this one's really interesting. So if I take this note and I move it up, right? It's a whole different vibe again. And you can really start to tweak and mess around with this, right? We can take this and right, so there's like tons of creative freedom with how you set up those kind of glides. And a lot of, Mesto does this, Brooks does this. They make some very creative choices with the glide and portamento. And it's usually not coming from just having overhanging notes. You're actually going in and putting these notes in after the fact. So that's really it for the leads in terms of layering. Obviously, you want to be aware of frequencies, right? So we took out a lot of the low frequencies to make it fit with the bass. You want to make sure that you're not having too many conflicting frequencies with the actual leads themselves, and they're kind of fitting a role, right? So this is like the body of the lead. This is the high end. It's kind of another high end, and this is like a mid body. That's kind of like the interesting weird sound that's tucked really low to make everything kind of have its own vibe. So let's check out the final thing we're looking at in this video, the chords, right? So a lot of times with Future Bounce, Future House, you'll have like a synth plug. It's very common to have, or this type of pad, right? It's like a basic synth pad. I don't know why I'm playing future music, but what I ended up doing, which was really cool, and I've heard this in a couple Future Bounce tracks, is they'll take that, what you'd typically hear with like a synth plug, and they'll use some weird, interesting sound. And that's where Sphere again can come in handy. So in this drop, we have this balafon patch. It's like kind of like a marimba. And that's layered with a plug and a synth patch. And you put that together and you get a more interesting sound. Now, in terms of theory, this is just following your bass line, right? And it's usually going to be kind of panned maybe a little bit out left and right. It's just there to support your chords. Now, if you're doing, or your lead rather, now if you're doing more of a Brooks thing, you're going to get much more in depth, and that'll be a whole other tutorial. This is, like I said, more of a Mesto vibe as opposed to a Brooks Future Bounce vibe, but you guys get the idea. So that sums up this video. I hope you guys got some cool, useful information about making a Future Bounce drop in it. If you guys want to check out Sphere, definitely check out. Link is in the description. It's a crazy sound set. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.